A dive bomber got caught in a thunderstorm and lost its own men. The formation broke up. The thunderstorm was very strong, not a weak one. The piercing white branching lightning flashed in all directions, and their dazzling zigzags did not make it any brighter, but on the contrary, as if it were even darker. The water flooded the lantern so that it seemed as if they had inadvertently dived somewhere under the water and were skimming somewhere above the bottom at full speed like a submarine. If it weren't for the altimeter, you'd think so. The compass was of little use, the arrow danced like a madwoman, and the other instruments worked like crazy. The commander was sure of only one thing, that he was able to maintain the same direction of flight, and in the fact that the height is decent, although the pawn sometimes tossed so that it fell down 100 meters. The aeroplane was shaking, it shook so that every rivet, every joint could be felt. Such flights in the middle of a terrible thunderstorm ended sadly, but there was nothing to be done. The navigator had no idea how far the storm front stretched in width and height. During the war with meteorological predictions is particularly bad. To more or less successfully predict the weather, you need to collect data from almost all of Europe, which in the conditions of the 44th year was, to put it mildly, difficult. It is unlikely that the Germans or their allies will share the data of meteorological observations, even if they are asked politely. The bomber went randomly, eastwards, all the time eastwards. At least in this you can be sure. The situation was dire, but there was a bright side to it. It was known for sure that they had already crossed the front line and had been flying over their territory for a long time. At least, they could not expect trouble from below in the form of anti-aircraft fire or the appearance of foreign machine gunners in case of forced landing. By the standards of civil aviation in peacetime, long ago should have left the plane, but the times were not peaceful for a year. And to leave the war machine in the air, fraught. Even if there are no consequences, you can stay, for a long time, pilots without an aircraft. Therefore, the commander began to seriously consider an emergency landing. Even if the aircraft will be damaged, it is still better than to jump out in the middle of nowhere, so that the empty car collapsed in the middle of nowhere. It is true that there were no bombs left. They bombed the railway junction qualitatively, but still, it's not much of a chance. The only trouble is that landing an airplane in such weather is even more dangerous than flying. He had no time to do anything. Everything around him changed in an instant. The plane was thrown downwards, so that his heart froze and all his insides rushed to his throat. And the next instant it seemed to them, all three of them, that it was unbearably bright. But they were only stars, and the sky was completely free of clouds. The sky was still the same, nocturnal, but it was clear. No thunderstorms, not a single cloud at all. The commander was confused for a moment. The machine even went into a dive. But he managed to get it out of there and understood why he had made a mistake, maneuvered like a green beginner. It seemed to him at first that the stars were on all sides. And no wonder. Who would have thought that in 1944 on the ground could be observed so bright and carefree illumination? The bomber was flying over a city, a very large city, and incredibly bright, incredibly carelessly illuminated. It was not supposed to be that way. It was simply not supposed to be that way according to wartime. And yet below stretched a whole sea of lights, brightly lit streets, scatterings of multicolored lanterns in large squares, intricately lit buildings, unfamiliar, incomprehensible, never seen before. He heard the navigator shriek in his headphones. He looked where he was pointing. To the right he could see a wide river, very wide as the Volga, or even wider. There were 3 islands on it, one much larger, oval, elongated, and the other 2 smaller, almost round. They were connected to each other and to the shores by wide, long bridges, shining with double chains of pink and greenish lights. And on the other shore the city continued. The lights went beyond the horizon in all directions as far as the eye could see. The commander turned the aeroplane round. He himself did not know why, but he did not want to move away from that place, from the point from which he saw this marvelous sight for the first time. Perhaps because that place was a little more familiar than the rest.
Guys, where have we gone?
I heard the almost panic-stricken voice of the gunner radio operator. The commander's brain worked with incredible speed. pumping in a second a huge amount of information. Guesses and reflections replaced each other with kaleidoscopic speed. Such a city, huge, brightly illuminated, was nowhere to be found. For a couple of thousand kilometers around, there should be no such cities. Almost all of Europe dutifully goes into blackout at night. Let's assume that in the north there is neutral Sweden, which does not bother to darken itself. On the contrary, flooding its night cities with lights so that they would not be inadvertently bombed by pilots of one or another warring party. To the west, there is neutral Switzerland, and even further away, Spain and Portugal. One important clarification: they would not have enough fuel to fly not only to Spain, but even to Switzerland. They might have been able to reach Sweden, but it was doubtful. Too short a time they flew in a thunderstorm. It would be foolish to think that they were picked up by some unknown whirlwind, traveling at a speed of 1,000 kilometers per hour, and thrown straight to neutral countries. And then the commander had once flown over Finland during the Soviet-Finnish War, and as usual studied the neighboring areas, that is, the same Sweden. He remembered very well that there was no such river, wide, full-flowing, with a city located on both its banks, in Sweden. It was a vicious circle. There was no such river in Sweden, and there could not be such an illumination on its territory. However, he did not remember such a river in the Soviet Union either. Nor did he know any such islands on the Volga. He had seen many cities brightly lit from above at night, but this one was nothing like them. It was different. It wasn't supposed to be at all. And yet everything that was happening to them was the truest reality. All feelings and sensations testified to it. The propellers rumbled, the engines rumbled familiarly. It was not a dream or a delusion, but a familiar cabin.
Commander, where are we?
Heard the voice of the gunner radio operator. The commander through his teeth answered profanely. What else was there to do? As if he knew where they were. He did not understand anything. He just habitually kept the machine at a certain altitude, riding out over the city, huge circles. And he saw that down below. No one even fussed. Not a single street lamp was extinguished. Streams of cars with bright headlights still flowed along the streets in all directions. Still went wild with a riot of colors, extinguished and again flashed incomprehensible fiery pictures. Only a few years later, after the war, having seen some films and illustrations in books, the commander realized that these mysterious pictures, figures, incomprehensible interlacing of light could be simply street advertising. The city reacted to the appearance of the bomber with astonishing nonchalance. To be more precise, it did not react at all. There was no sign that the local air defense services had begun to work, that they even existed. The illuminations had not been extinguished. No searchlight beams fumbled across the sky. No night fighters could be seen guarding the skies above the city. There was peace below. Otherwise, the reaction on the ground would have been very different. The most interesting thing was that at this thought, the commander felt only irritation and even, perhaps, anger. They were entrenched here while the others were fighting. The radio gunner started to whine again to be explained where they were, and the commander sent him an open text, ordered him to shut up and keep quiet for a while. Asked the navigator,
"What do you think?"
After all, the navigator had a much closer relationship to orientation in space than the other two.
"That it's a dream, or a delusion,"
said the navigator.
Is it possible that three people dream about the same thing? Or that three people dream the same thing?
Asked the commander. The navigator had to confess that he had never heard of such a thing in his life. But reasoning theoretically, he was inclined to think that it really does not happen. Then he said in a strange alien floating voice,
"Vadim, what if we have already... that... if we... this..."
And he stopped talking. The commander understood him perfectly well. He swore even more profanely, and asked with all the sarcasm he was capable of,
Is this what the other world looks like to you? Like this?
"Yes, indeed. Sorry, I said bullshit. The priest described it differently. But what is it, eh? Shall we go lower, or should we sit down?"
said the navigator ashamed. The commander mumbled something negative. For some reason, he didn't want to go lower, let alone land. although there were plenty of flat places in the neighborhood where it was possible to make an emergency landing without much risk.
Why? This is not Germany. Think about it.
Continued the navigator. The commander himself was ready to give his hand that it was not Germany down there. Anything, anywhere, but not the Reich. In the Reich, it's been a long time since they burned lights at night so carefree. He drove the plane round and round, unable to make a decision that would change the situation at once, or even to come up with any idea of where they had gone. He froze in his seat, habitually performing simple maneuvers while mysterious fiery pictures raged below. The streets were streaming with traffic, and brightly illuminated, peaceful ships sailed by on the river. The view below was incredibly beautiful, but that was why it caused a serious irritation, sometimes turning into anger. They were entrenched, damn them, and suddenly everything ended independently of them, beyond their will and desire. On the left, completely different lights rose above the ground. Dozens, maybe even hundreds of bright green lights that formed the outline of a giant isosceles triangle. The triangle was indeed gigantic. It rose above a good half of the city, as if opening a hatch thrust at the bomber, and the commander instinctively clenched his eyes, expecting a blow. It seemed suddenly that inside, between the lights, not a void, that there is something there. There was no blow. When the stripes of green lights were on the sides of the plane, something happened. There's no way to describe it in words. There just aren't any words. Something. And in the next moment, Petlyakov found itself in a completely different sky, with rare stars shining in the gaps of melting storm clouds. Whatever it was, they had passed the thunderstorm. Fuel was running out, and the commander, having checked the instruments, began to descend, continuing to fly eastwards. Pretty soon he was flying at a gentle glide over a railway station with a distinctive water pump. He knew this station. It was 50 kilometers from here to their airfield, but, most importantly, the territory was his own. And he went for a landing, landed in a meadow. Even the landing gear did not break. It was all right. They had enough time to discuss what had happened and make a decision. When anxious Red Army soldiers from the station guards began to approach the plane in a chain, when they were shouted at to identify themselves, they knew exactly what they should say in the regiment. More precisely, what should not be said. There was no such thing as an unknown city, nothing like that. The plane simply got into a thunderstorm, lost orientation, and while they decided, exhausted the fuel. That's all. It's a very believable, real-life story. Nobody even doubted it. Such things happened all over the place, and the aircraft was not damaged at all, and there were no claims against them. For all the years that have passed since then, the commander never had any intelligible explanation. He preferred not to guess in vain, if it was impossible to check any guesses. But the resentment remained, an established, serious one. Blowing smoke, looking somewhere to the side. The commander spoke in a deaf voice in which this old grudge sounded clearly.
The impression that they threw us out, like naughty kittens, to keep us out of the way. They took us by the scruff of the neck and threw us out so we wouldn't hang around in their peaceful, clean skies. On the other hand, they didn't have to give us flowers. At least they didn't open fire on us with all calibers. They could have, couldn't they? But what it is and where it is, I'm not going to guess.